It's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Ron Jenkins. And Ron is a board member of Waterfront for All. And he has the good fortune to have spent many years enjoying what the Toronto waterfront has to offer. Growing up in a sailing family, Ron's always sailed and raced on Lake Ontario and elsewhere as a member of the National Yacht Club. Ron's also an avid photographer, particularly interested in nature and sailing photography, and has an ongoing interest in the many topics of historical interest that the Toronto waterfront contains. These recreational pursuits have led Ron to recognize that the use of and public access to the waterfront is a legacy worth protecting and improving. And as a result, Ron lends support to citizens groups such as the Greater Waterfront Coalition and Waterfront for All. And it's a pleasure to have him with us this evening. And Ron, please take it away. And you can run your slideshow as soon as you feel the urge.
Okay. Well, thanks all for coming. I'm supposing that most of you follow the issues of the waterfront and the airport in particular. And if you do, you've probably seen quite a bit of news in the last month or so. We'll try to get to that, as well as looking into the past. What I want to see in looking at the past is alternative paths that the airport might have taken in its history, and where we got to and where we might go. So with that, I'll put up a presentation and we'll see what you can see. Perhaps, Edward, you can let me know if that screen is showing now.
I see it clearly. I hope everyone else does. One thing I'd like to tell people, just to highlight them, is in the top right-hand corner of both Zoom screens, there should be a button that says View, and you can adjust that at your end so you can change and control how you see Zoom. I would recommend taking a side-by-side view, speaker view side-by-side, and that would, for optimal viewing, so you can see Ron and also see his presentation. Excellent, thank you. Someone else has said yes. Everything's fine, Ron, take it away.
All right. So I thought I'd start with something a little ironic, just a quote from the Star in 1974. The island airport is the center of a controversy that must soon be resolved. Should the property be made into an airport for short takeoff and landing planes, perhaps with a bridge to the mainland and a parking lot? Should it become part of the Toronto Island Park? Should it be used for housing? Or should it be kept for a few more years for general aviation? The politicians will decide within the next year. I don't know how many of those politicians are still alive, but the decision hasn't been made yet. But the airport starts with lake filling, and it begins actually before the airport. I'd like to show you here just a map of Toronto in 1906, and of particular interest is the area where the island nearly reaches the shore, called the Western Channel. Oops, we have a Western Gap now. And the Western Channel here is the original Western Channel. A new one was built subsequently around 1911 in this area. One thing to notice, however, is that the island is at this point a couple of sandbars reaching towards the city. And on one of them is the area of Hanlon's Point, which had a ball stadium and an amusement park with a roller coaster and so on. And in 1911, the Toronto Harbour Commission began a very ambitious plan to renovate the entire waterfront. And this is something of what they had in mind. in this design, and it was one of several. The new Western Gap is here, separating now a filled area and the city. And they envisioned a road running across the Western Gap on a bridge, running all the way through the Toronto Islands and over across the Eastern Gap and out. That road was not fulfilled, obviously. But in this period, the City Board of Control saw the need for aviation in the city and resolved that the Harbor Board, the Board of Toronto Harbor Commissioners, be asked to report on developing the West Island Sandbar for a seaplane, flying boat, and amphibian airplane base. The West Island Sandbar being that area right there. So Hamlin's Point in the early 1920s had an amusement park, and there's the roller coaster and the ball stadium, and also featured sometimes a pair of diving horses. It's hard for me to talk about the waterfront without talking about the diving horses. It's just a personal indulgence. But I've also put in a pointing finger here to a small object at the end of the Western Gap wall. The Western Gap walls now are filled in on the south, but at the time of construction, they extended out into the water. And the small object at the end there is a range light for guiding ships into the harbor. That little object actually still exists today. The Harbor Commission filled in this area, which was a regatta rowing area, and this area to the west of the Western Sandbar. And this area became the original island airport. And to do that, they used massive dredges, including this particular one, the Cyclone, which was a hydraulic dredge pumping up silt from the bottom and pumping it through pipes to wherever they wanted to form land. And you can see that the land for the airport was filled in stages, first in 1908 and 11, just joining the sides of the Western Channel. And then a little later in 1916, adding a bit more. And it stayed that way until the start of the airport construction in 1937 and 38, which is now the filling of the regatta course and adding that area to the west. This is the format of land, or the land form, I guess you'd say, for the original island airport. It didn't change until 1961, when they added another piece out to the west and a little bit into the east, so that they could reorient the runway, because the initial runway ran on this axis, pointing more or less in towards the city. This gave them something a little better for avoiding the city, heading on a different angle. And over here now is the configuration of the airport until this runway was closed a couple of years ago. So this is 1938, and you can see the lake filling that's going on here has been more or less completed, and they're leveling it ahead of building runways. I've put the pointing finger now again at that little object out on the end of the land. This is the range light that I spoke of earlier. And in fact, the range light is complemented by a girderwork structure on the inside shore that you might see in some of these shots. The connection to the present is interesting, because when you see the earlier images, you see those sandbars, and you can see them here in green. They remained city property. The yellow area was Harbor Commission land, and a couple of pieces here and here, just on the end in brown, were federal lands. And that's important because those three pieces of land ownership became the signatories to what's called the Tripartite Agreement, which is the agreement that governs airport operations to the day. It started in 1983. It runs for 50 years. This slide shows, in fact, that some of the airport planning and agreement planning happened earlier in the 1970s. I won't go into the detail there, but I will point out that the Tripartite Agreement as it exists now does a few things. It limits, it prohibits jet traffic, and it prohibits extensions to runways. And it also prohibits vehicular landside traffic link or a bridge. It also imposes tight restraints on noise, both per aircraft and daily noise, and it imposes operating hour curfews. It's also stipulated that the airport was to be used for general aviation, these are private aircraft, and limited short takeoff and landing aircraft called STOL aircraft. Short takeoff and landing is a definition. Well, there's more than one definition, but a usual definition is to say that an aircraft must be able to take off in 1,000-foot runway and clear a 50-foot height on takeoff, and be able to land clearing a 50-foot height and stopping within 1,000 feet. And in 1985, so a couple of years after the initial Tripartite Agreement, there was an amendment giving specific permission for the de Havilland, it should say, sorry, the de Havilland Dash 8 STOL aircraft, which was newly developed by de Havilland at the time. That airport agreement did not include limits on numbers of passengers or the numbers of daily flights. And those things, while not regulated, were considered to be constrained by the noise caps that would limit the number of flights, remember daily noise, and also limit the types of aircraft, and that they felt would limit the number of passengers. But before the airport, there was a flying history in Toronto. And it really began with this guy here, McCurdy. He was the aviation pioneer really for Canada. And one of the things that he did was the first intercity air race in Canada in 1911, flying from Hamilton to Toronto. He didn't have a place to land in Toronto, but he intended to land on the eastern beaches, which he found full of people. So he circled back to Ward's Island and saw the Ward's Island beach was full of people, and eventually landed somewhere along in the area of Cherry Beach, interrupting a wedding, crashing the wedding. Well, not crashing his plane, but crashing the wedding nonetheless. It kind of exemplifies a very early instance of competing uses of the waterfront. But very soon after, within a couple of years, there was an aviation school on the waterfront. You could learn to fly. And the Curtis Aviation School of Flying operated off of Hanlon's Point and took planes around through the Western Gap and flew out from what's now Hanlon's Beach. They had 3 planes, and in fact, you can see all of them in this shot. The first commercial operation began with a couple of World War I aces, Billy Bishop and William Barker, who, sorry, William should have a double L there, who started flying flights from Toronto to Muskoka. This particular photograph shows their aircraft in Belleville, Ontario. But there it is in Muskoka here. First airplane, Barker's or Billy Bishop's. It says here Rosso Bay. So that's up in Muskoka on Lake Rosso. And for quite a long time, flying in and out of Toronto was a marine operation. There was no land-based flying. And in 1929, the first airmail came into Toronto from Buffalo, and this airplane, called maybe quite often a flying boat. And really, you look at it and you see the boat quite clearly there. You can take the whole airplane apparatus off and just see a boat. Later flying in the airport, and I go through these ones, these were flying up to and around the time of the first of the Tripartite Agreement. And these were all commercial ventures: Air Otonabee, City Express, Air Ontario, and so on. Each one of these and many others had relatively short existences. But in 1985, as I pointed out earlier, the Stoll aircraft had obtained permission, and in particular this plane, the de Havilland Dash 8. The Dash 8-100 was the first of these, and that was the plane that was in use at the time of the agreement to fly Dash 8s into the airport. So in 2006 and onwards, you wind up with this, which is vastly different from this and this. And the question is, why do we have these things flying in and out of the airport? Because, surprise, they are still Dash 8s. You know, you call it a Dash 8 and it's a Dash 8. And if you allow Dash 8s, then presumably this is what you've allowed. These are no longer, however, anything like a short takeoff and landing aircraft. But let's go to the early history of the airport. And when I say early, I'm really talking about going back 11,000 years. Flying was different then, but it's not flying I'm focusing on. What I'm focusing on is glaciation. At that time, the Laurentide ice sheet crossed across northern Ontario and into Quebec. And what you can see is that the ice sheet was closing off the St. Lawrence exit from Lake Ontario to the ocean. And the result was that the water level of Lake Ontario rose. And you may well be familiar with this already. Lake Iroquois was the precursor to Lake Ontario and much larger. The water from Lake Iroquois exited out the Mohawk River and took that channel out. But that ice eventually melted. And as it melted, it opened up the St. Lawrence again, but in quite a different way. That is to say, having had like 4 kilometers of ice sitting, pressing down on the land for tens of thousands of years, that land had been depressed, physically depressed by the weight of ice. And when the ice melted, the St. Lawrence opened and flowed more freely to the ocean than it does today. And as a result, the body of water that we call Lake Ontario now drained down to something about 1/3 the size of our current Lake Ontario. It's called Admiralty Lake. And it is possible for people to explore the original shoreline of Admiralty Lake underwater. There are trees and shoreline that have been covered. So this Admiralty Lake only existed for a fairly short time before the geostatic rebound brought the land back up, closed off some of that St. Lawrence flow, and the lake level rose up again to where it is today. But for a period, Lake Ontario was much more of a puddle. This is a water level in Lake Ontario as much as 60 meters lower than today's level. And it formed shoreline in particular around Lake Ontario and in the Toronto area. And the resulting formation is called the Toronto Scarp. You can see it here on the contour lines for the shore, or for the bottom of the lake, bathyspheric lines. The Toronto Scarp is actually quite sharply dropping off just south of Toronto Island and just south of the Leslie Street Spit. Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. Most people don't know it's there because, you know, you don't see it. You see this, the Lake Iroquois equivalent, the Scarborough Bluffs, but one of Toronto's largest, most significant in some ways geographic landform, nobody ever sees. But what it does is it creates a whole large flat area called the Toronto Shelf. And the Toronto Shelf really extends from, you know, up in towards Humber Bay, around south of the island, south of the Leslie Street Spit, and out over heading towards the Scarborough Bluffs. So the Toronto Islands and what's now the Portlands and all of what we really consider sort of central waterfront area is sitting on a shelf elevated from the lake bed by a fair bit. And what you get in this, in consequence of this, is quite shallow water all through this area, dropping off suddenly to much deeper water in a very quick distance. And that shallow water, of course, was what was filled in to create the island airport up here. Jumping now to 1968. And I do jump around in the chronology here, but it's kind of important. 1968, a couple of ideas were developed for airport development and waterfront development, called the Bold Concept. The Bold Concept began with the Harbor Commission, as many waterfront initiatives did. And part of the Bold Concept was Harbor City, which was a largely residential community. And let me show you what it was looking like. What you can see here is Harbor City exists where the island airport is today. And it expands on that landfill. It heads out to the west, past the edge of Ontario Place to the west, and it fills large way into the inner harbor, in fact, all the way over to Harbor Square, with plans for roadways across to actually join this piece of land to the city and connect it with a system of bridges. Inside Harbor City were waterways and canals and housing structures, mid-rise housing structures bordering those. It included some other things too, but that's the basic concept. And along with that concept came the idea of moving the island airport southward. So you can see a construction here. Island Airport is now to the south of Gibraltar Point, built out into the lake, but notice where it is positioned. It's still on the Toronto Shelf, which makes lake filling in that area technically feasible. The water's not too deep to fill in there. This airport didn't happen for numerous reasons, among them that the flight paths out of that airport would conflict with the airport up in Malton. Also for political reasons. I mean, it seems every single decision relating to the Toronto Island Airport is both physical, political, legal, economic, and that's the case here. But this was a concept that was initial with the Harbor City model. Another Harbor
Ron,
City model. Yes.
sorry, Ron, man, just sorry. I know we did say we take questions at the end of the, and primarily we absolutely will take questions at the end, but there is a quick clarification question because you were recently talking about the Scarp. And the question is, is the edge of Old Lake Iroquois, is that the steep drop at Dupont? And was that part of the Toronto Scarp, or is that something different?
Yeah, no, it's part of it. I took out a slide that actually shows the Iroquois, Lake Iroquois shoreline running through Toronto, and you can track it all the way along. So Casa Loma is sitting up on top of the old shoreline, and Dupont is running along the water's edge. Dupont and Davenport, in particular, right. Davenport Road in that area. In fact, Davenport Road is in some concepts the oldest road in the world because it was a footpath for people 10,000 years ago. When the water was at that level and that was the beach and people walked along that shore, that's how that road got started.
Thank you very much,
so
Ron.
Anyway, so yeah, Toronto's got the oldest road in the world, if you look at it that way. This design here is another design. You can see Harbor City still in place there, but you can see some different lake filling concepts here. In particular, something that was never actually put in, a piece of land on the Scarp here, and the airport over here underneath, to the south of the Portlands. The outer harbor as we know it would be here. But this lake filling vision was actually not attained either. There was significant political objection coming from the beaches area to this concept, because now beaches people were suddenly going to find an airport moving over them. But the harbor commissioners, you know, like when your only tool is a dredge, everything looks like a lake filling project. So I guess that's. Here's another one. This one puts the airport, in this case, it's a stall port, not a longer range airport. So this was a small stall port designed to hold maybe five docks for planes, a short runway to take off and land, and access through Leslie Street on the Leslie Street spit. The concept here is that Leslie Street spit is really only a way to get to the airport, nothing more. And getting to the airport in this conception would be like from the central downtown area, just over the railway lands, scoot along Gardner or Lakeshore, down Leslie Street and out to the Stoll Port. Everything was easy in the 60s, right? Here's another idea where some of that lake filling would become a recreational area. Harbor City still exists up here, and the airport concept is entirely out here on the what you would have called the eastern spit rather than the spit itself. Looking from the sort of aerial view across the Harbor City, you can see some sort of a cart, I don't know what you call it, drawing, but it's drawing on top of a photograph. These are the grain elevators here at the eastern edge of the Western Gap. Here's a bridge over into Harbor City. And here's something similar. This is defining the some of the buildings of Harbor City a little more clearly. And then what you have is modeling, physical models here. Harbor City residential kind of looked like something out of Expo 67, and that's maybe not surprising because it was only a couple of years after. But this Toronto Star article does point out, it says opposition is already forming against the new harbor plan introduced this week by Stanley Randall, the province's Minister of Trade and Development. Some city politicians are complaining they're not being given enough time to study the impact of putting 60,000 people on the island, most of whom they believe will have cars. I'll call that Harbor City an inflection point in the sense that it could have happened and didn't happen. There was support for the idea and it kind of went away. Here's another inflection point, and these are not the only inflection points in airport history by any means, but this is the 2013 Porter Airlines jet expansion proposal. Porter brought forth a proposal to do two things, to modify two elements of that tripartite agreement. One was to permit runway lengthening by lake filling, and in this model you can see the east and the west ends of that runway. This is inside the harbor. This is out just by Ontario Place. And what they were expecting or hoping to do was to put in 200 meters of lake filling here to extend the runway, and the same over here. Now, these were presented as not disrupting anything because they would be all built within the existing marine exclusion zone, that MEZ area. But if you do look at this, you realize that this is really a simplified view of reality, for at least the fact that the taxiway that took people to the end of the runway here would actually have to have been built out this way to service the western end, and you would similarly need to extend a taxiway out here to the east. There were many other elements, but the request in itself was to extend the runways and permit the use of jet aircraft for commercial flying. Both of these things had been precluded by the formation of the Tripartite Agreement. Porter Airlines wanted to turn those over and make the change. The aircraft that they wanted to fly there was the CS-100 from Bombardier. That plane is now the Airbus A220-100, I believe. However, this was the one that they thought would be a good one to fly in and out of the Toronto Island Airport. The city's response to that, there was obviously a lot of public debate, you might well remember, but the city's response to that was to ask for a consideration of consequences. And they wanted many things studied and investigated. And this, I won't read it to you, you can come back later and look at it in the slide, are some of the things that the city thought needed to be built into a preliminary analysis before deciding whether or not to proceed with this. And as you look at this, suddenly you realize, okay, so asking for a runway extension and a jet ban removal sounds small, but the impacts are enormous. And that was critical to, I think, eventually the opposition to it and the refusal. But the refusal was actually not from the city. It came from the federal government. Remember, there are 3 signatories to the Tripartite Agreement. The federal government changed in October 2015. Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister, and within a month, his Transport Minister, Marc Garneau at the time, issued a pair of tweets that said, as the new Minister of Transport, I've been enjoying learning about my files, including regarding Toronto Island Airport. I confirm that Government of Canada position is the same as Liberal Party of Canada commitment. We will not reopen tripartite agreement for the island airport YTZ. That killed the proposal to expand the Porter proposal. It got Mark Garneau a little bit of heat for doing things in Twitter, but that doesn't shake the earth anymore. Another thing in the history of the airport is a history of bridges and tunnels. And you could see bridges there in the Harbor City model. Even before the airport was built in 1935, a tunnel to the island airport had begun. And it was canceled in the same year with again with a change of government at the federal level. But you can see here, they're beginning to dig. Oh, and here is a girderwork structure. This is the inside range light. I talked about the outside range light at the other end of the Western Gap. This is the inside range light that would be lined up with the outside range light. This structure is still there today. Nevertheless, okay, so this was killed when the government changed. And it didn't kill the concept, as I point out here, subsequent bridge and tunnel efforts in 51, 64, 73, 89, 92, 95, and so on. They were all frustrated until 2015, when the Port Authority, now not Harbor Commission, because that changed in 1999, succeeded in putting in a pedestrian tunnel. Part of the way they were able to do that was to locate the entire landside operation on Port Authority land, which might explain why it's kind of got elevators down and escalators up and so on. That's, you know, an $82 million project. And I'm sure some of you have been through it. It's pretty magnificent in some ways. But I really do wonder, you know, why they didn't just say, put a second ferry dock here and run 2 ferries back and forth. They had 2 ferries, you know, they could double their vehicular traffic. They could double their traveling public traffic. They could scale it up and down. Anyway, never mind. They didn't do that. They built the pedestrian tunnel. Other inflection points in the airport are the terminals, and these are in some ways quite ironic. The newly completed island airport had a small terminal here, kind of the sort of terminal you see maybe on you would have seen at the time on lots of little airfields. And here's the runway running east to west. Notice this is pre-1961. The 1961 and later runway comes more like this on an angle. And there's your outer range light and your inner range tower here, the Western Gap. So that little terminal was the Toronto Island Airport terminal. I couldn't find a better picture that said Toronto Island Airport on it. However, it was declared a National Historic Site in 1989. The airport did eventually outgrow it, and they moved the airport away from its location and repositioned it just on the ground in the southeast property of the airport. They said in 2014 that they were going to make it a restaurant, and that's kind of where the whole story ended. It still sits there today, probably looking worse than it did in 2014. This is, however, 2014. Notice it's called Toronto City Centre Airport now. The airport name changed and then changed again to Billy Bishop Toronto City Airport. What was built was a terminal here. And actually what you can see in this picture is a little patch of ground. That's where the old terminal had been. It was taken away just before this this picture was photographed. But this is now the Porter terminal. Porter paid to get this done, ironically using money that it had received from being blocked on a bridge project, the bridge project that was turned down by the Mayor Miller in 2003, led to payouts, and some of that went to Regco, which enabled them to build a terminal, and the Harbor Commission to upgrade the ferry service. Porter built this terminal and then sold it. So they built that terminal for $50 million and they sold it in 5 years later for $700 million, more than $700 million. And if you're wondering how that happened, I mean, Toronto real estate's crazy, but this is something else. The reason that Porter was able to sell it to Newport for that huge price was because they committed to buying and using time at the terminal. And they committed to, the airport runs a system of flight allocation times called slots. The airport has 202 slots at the moment. It had fewer earlier, but of that 202, 172 of them belong to Porter Airlines. And Porter said to Newport, we'll use those slots. We'll pay you for the use of those slots, 172 slots every day. A slot is a takeoff or a landing. The reason I'm going into some of this detail relates to things happening right now. So the Billy Bishop Toronto City Airport today has a large chunk of Porter's fleet sitting on the runway 0824. That's the smaller of the two runways. So that's why they've got a sort of a lit X here so that planes don't try and land where planes are parked. And they've been sitting there since March 2020. And the real question here with that COVID shutdown is, when will commercial flights resume? Porter Airlines has pushed the date out 11 times. The most recent statement they've made was that they're going to be starting September the 8th. Maybe it'll happen, limited approach, but that's what they're talking about. But that period from March 2020 until 2018, now coming up to August, has been a time for no flying for Porter or Air Canada, the other commercial tenant at the airport. And we really have to wonder, what are the financial costs of this? To the Toronto Port Authority, we know that they had in 2020 a $12.6 million net loss, a $19 million gross loss, but a $12.6 million net loss versus the previous year, 2019, when they had a $3.5 million surplus out of the airport. So from March till the end, March 2020 till the end of the year, they lost a lot of money. We don't know what Porter Airlines lost. We don't know what Newport Aviation, the terminal operator, has lost, and we don't know what the other stakeholders have lost. But between Porter Airlines and Newport Aviation is a problem, and that is a dispute because Porter Airlines doesn't want to pay Newport for quite a lot of stuff. And Porter began with a claim against Newport in November 2020, and Newport replied. And then in March of this year and April this year, they've exchanged other legal documents. The issues in dispute, actually, before I leave that, the issues in dispute are primarily to do with how Porter pays Newport for use of the terminal and what they contracted to do. Remember that $700 million that Newport was counting on was built around counting on Porter paying them to use the terminal. Porter's not using the terminal. Porter is saying, we are not using the terminal, so we're not going to pay you to use the terminal. Newport is saying that wasn't the deal. That's it in a nutshell, but it's not all about COVID. Porter had started before COVID saying, we're not going to use all our slots, so we're not going to pay you for all our slots. That was a change that started in late 2019 and was the beginning of friction. So here it is. In 2015, Porter sold their terminal to Newport for more than $700 million. The sale included a license agreement whereby Porter, and this agreement applies to Air Canada as well, but Air Canada is a small part of it relative to Porter, where Porter is charged fees by Newport for the use of the terminal based upon its allocation of daily slots. And starting in January 2020, Porter elected, they call it, to reduce its use of slots. They called that relinquishment. Whether relinquishing slots is permitted in the agreement is a contested area. And this is really the point of the law that is in contest here. But in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic impacted aviation worldwide. So Porter stopped paying for all slots, not just for the slots that they thought they didn't have to pay for. And they claimed that apart from border closures and so on, that Newport was responsible for them not flying because Newport had not made the terminal suitable for use. Porter was saying it was unsafe because of COVID. There were additional issues as well. Porter is disputing paying advertising fees during the pandemic, advertising that it pays Newport to put advertisements, for example, in their shuttle bus, the Newport shuttle bus. And Newport in turn is cashing security deposits that were placed by Porter because the agreement said in default of payment, these security deployments can be cashed, deposits can be cashed. And at another point, just a little later, I don't want to get too far into the details, but Porter also pledged 3 of their aircraft as security deposits to Newport, and Newport is claiming those. And at points, according to Newport, Porter has threatened to stop operating at the Billy Bishop Airport altogether. And just to get an idea of the money involved, I won't go through this all, but what I will do is point out simply that the license agreement fees here are $900 plus taxes per day per slot, and a ground handling fee of $85 plus taxes per day per daily slot. These are year round. And so you take 900 and put on 13% for HST. You take 85 and put another 13% on, and then you multiply that by 172 every day. So every day Porter is supposed to be paying Newport something in the range of $192,000. And Newport is billing Porter for that, and Porter is refusing to pay. That's what's going on. And Newport contends that Porter is now about $70 million in arrears and counting. Another issue completely unrelated to this, but probably not completely unrelated to this, is the Toronto Port Authority, who in March of this year put out a request for expressions of interest on partnership. They're looking for somebody to come in as a financial investor on the airport. They haven't announced anybody interested in doing that, and frankly, who would? But what it tells you is that the Port Authority is hurting as well. And they should be hurting. I mean, the airport represents 85% of Port Authority revenues. This is not a shipping Port Authority, it's an airport Port Authority. So we've got future inflection points for the island airport. We're looking ahead a little bit now. But to do that, we're looking a little back into the past. In 2018, the airport issued a master plan. And I'll just skip through this quickly so that we don't spend too much time. But the master plan includes renovations to the north end of the airport property, which straighten out taxiways and make it possible to build more terminal properties and so on to the west of the existing structures there. And also to build an area down to the south, in the south corner of the airport property, to build in hangars for general aviation. That's the personal aircraft. And they recognize in here their challenges and opportunities. And I'm only going to focus on one of them. And that is a challenge they call the runway and safety area requirement. This airport was never built with safety in mind. I think that's fair to say. And as a consequence, the runways end very close to the water. Transport Canada has said many airports in the country, including Billy Bishop, need to have 150 meters of clear space after the end of the runway in case an aircraft lands short or runs too far long on the landing. And Billy Bishop doesn't have the landmass to do that. So how are they going to do it? Well, whatever the option is, I won't go through them now, but the options are all expensive, and the Port Authority would have to pay for that right at the time when they're bleeding money. They do include in that a managed growth strategy for the airport, increasing airport traffic, they say, to an ultimate forecast of 3.6 million passengers by 2024. They're projecting increases that are unlikely to happen when you look at the previous years, 2014, 15, and 16, and realize things flatlined after that and then took a dive in 2020 and will be down in 2021 and going forward. So the question is, question often asked, are jets coming to Billy Bishop Airport? The short answer is no. And for a number of reasons, but technically there was a change in regulations to airspace requirements, TP 312 5th edition, that happened in 2015 that prevent some of the model airspace that was in the Porter proposal of 2013. Politically too, at the federal level, this won't change until a change at the federal level. But airport expansion is in the cards. The Port Authority does want increased flights and increased passenger numbers. Whether they can do that is another question. And also remember, as I point out, the question of the airport lease is something that keeps getting kicked down the road. That lease expires in 2033. And then to add to all of this, just this week, Porter confirmed a rumor that they had previously been denying, that they are buying aircraft. This is a mock-up on their website of an Embraer E195E2. They say that they're going to be flying these from Pearson starting in late 22. And you do wonder, or at least I wonder, what that means for their operation at Billy Bishop Airport, and where they're getting the money. I mean, they're not putting any passengers on planes, and they're not paying their bills to the terminal, but But in March 2020, they did get a $135 million loan from Export Development Canada. And in June 2021, they got a $270.5 million loan from the Canada Enterprise Emergency Funding Corporation. That's for helping out COVID businesses or businesses hurt by COVID. The question is, are these really going to pay out? Are they going to be repaid? What's going to happen? How is it that Porter can buy, they claim 30 and up to 80 of these jets, and yet they can't pay their bills? It's weird. Another consideration that plays into it is the carbon footprint of regional flying. The federal government talks about slashing greenhouse gases and increasing rail traffic, particularly on the rail lines from Toronto to Quebec City. And related to carbon is climate change. And this is a picture here that I took in June 2019, when we had that very high water. We had high water on the lake in 2017 and 2019. This is 2019, the day before the high record was set. This is looking across the Western Gap. So the water of the Western Gap is sitting in the foreground. Then there's a big puddle on the airport lands between the taxiway and the runway. And there's another puddle on the other side near the windsock. The Toronto Islands were carefully mapped by the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority for flooding models in 2017. And what they said in 2017 was, the island airport would look like this when the lake level was 75.3 meters. It says IGLD 85. That means International Great Lakes Datum 1985. In other words, simply 75.3 meters above sea level measured in 1985, because sea level always changes too. So this is what the airport looks like. It's not flooding when the lake is at 75.3 meters. The 2017 record high level was 75.88 meters, and the 2019 record, a new record again, was 75.92. So what do those look like? Well, we'll just look at the 75.92. When the lake is now at 75.9 meters, remember, I'll just go back up a page, 75.3, now it's 75.9. So that's 6.6 meters higher. There's flooding on the lands. And that we saw in 2019. 2019 reached 75.92. The modeling also shows if you go up to 76.2 meters, that's another 0.9, another 0.3 of a meter, a third of a meter, let's call it another foot. If you had 2019 flood levels plus a foot, the airport lands would be pretty well flooded throughout. So, a source of carbon in the air and climate change is actually being fed into by, or feeding into the airport itself and its water levels. And remember, this was a lake filling project sitting on a sandbar. So it was never really considered at the time, 1938, 1939, that the lake level was going to fluctuate like this. Although we've also seen it fluctuate tens of meters over thousands of years. So, we might well see that airport affected by water before anything else. Which brings us to the big question, and we're not going to talk about it, but at least I'm not going to talk about it in any more detail today, but that lease expires in 2033. Without a renewal, that city land is designated as parkland, what's going to happen is really, again, going to be a political topic. So thank you for your time. And I guess Edward and Deborah can accumulate questions. It looks like there are some here, maybe already appearing in the chat.
Well, thank you very much, Ron. I really appreciate that. There's a couple of things that have come up. So I'm not sure if some of you may know how to, if there is something that someone can, I think, expand on in great detail. You can either put it in the chat or actually, because there's only 63 of us. We obviously can't hear from everyone in person, but we might be able to take a couple of verbal comments, especially I think Brian Eiler's with us this evening. Hi, Brian. Because here's a thing that has come up. So I'm just going to summarize a few things here. Ron, my understanding, and you or perhaps if Mr. Eiler puts his hand up and we can find him in among the 63 shining faces. My understanding is Newport's purchase to Porter is 2 private companies, and we don't actually have access to the details of how that works itself out, or whether they wrote a bank draft for 700 million, or whether it's coming in dribs and drabs. Am I correct in thinking that's not public information?
Yeah, we don't know the payment model, but we do know the amount is more than $700 million because the legal documents that they've just filed say so. The legal documents make a number of references to the license agreement between Porter and Newport. I don't have a copy of the license agreement, but it's quite clear from the pieces of the license agreement what the issues are in dispute.
Right. Okay. And what do we think
Presumably,
about?
too, that will all come out in court.
Right.
That
okay.
would, yeah.
And that should be fun. That should be fun. Hours and hours of fun
Yes.
watching that play itself out. I know that I think Julie Beddoes and a couple of other people said, who were questioning when we were talking about enhanced train service. Now, we might wish that we had a TGV from here to Montreal, but even just improved 200 kilometer an hour improved train service that doesn't have to dodge freight trains. One might think that would have an impact on the case for a downtown airport. I suppose, though, true airline fanatics would tell you that train travel will never have an impact on that. Because, but what are your thoughts on that, Ron?
Well, there is a saying that goes, "Time to spare, go by air," right? Because when you figure in all of the boarding requirements and clearances and security checks and so on, the flying time is a small part usually of regional flying.
Very much reminds me, as some folks know, I'm originally from Victoria, BC, right? And people will say, oh, it's an hour and 45-minute ferry ride plus about an hour to the terminal and an hour to, from one ferry terminal to another. So it's about, you're trying to allow at least 3 hours from downtown Vancouver to downtown Victoria. And people say, oh, but flying only takes 20 minutes. Well, right. the plane's in the air for 20 minutes, but when by the time you get to Vancouver Airport and get through the airport and get, Victoria Airport and get downtown, guess what? It's about 3 hours. So it's about the same amount of time. It doesn't really save you any significant time. And
no,
exactly to your point.
Unless you're like, going to have a helicopter land on your backyard like Donald Trump, you're not getting to the airport
right.
any fast way.
And rumors that Waterfront for All has an electric powered helicopter that goes right to our world headquarters are false.
They're denied.
They're denied. We're denying that. It doesn't exist, right? I was fascinated by the flooding scenario because I know that projections such as they are based on the International Panel on Climate Change tend to suggest that we will expect higher lake levels in the Great Lakes rather than lower lake levels, which of course will be a concern for the southern parts of downtown Toronto. And of course, that is being factored in to Waterfront Toronto's plans, project ongoing right now on Villiers Island and the creation of those new things. But presumably, like you said, regardless of tripartite agreements, regardless of anything else, it would seem to me that flooding will be a significant concern. And maybe I will actually, if it's, Ron, is it okay? I think I might ask Brian either to make a couple
Sure.
of comments on the future thing, because Brian, it seems to me a good throw to you is that it would strike me, just as an ordinary citizen, that a park, oh my Lord, did I say that? A park at the Island Airport would be easier, much easier to deal, lend itself to dealing with flooding issues than an airport. Brian, I'm going to ask to unmute you, or maybe Deborah, do you have to unmute Brian?
Unmuted,
Oh, there you are.
unmuted.
There you are, Brian.
Yeah.
Brian, do you want to just riff a little bit on some of the things we were just talking about?
Well, the first thing, and I did put it into the comment, was that we do know that Newport insisted that the cash it paid be applied against Porter's debt. So that Porter then claimed it had no debt as a result of the sale of the terminal. And so that suggests that they paid cash in about $400 million. And it's hard to imagine that, given 12 years left on the tripartite agreement or the lease, that they would have paid much more than that until the lease was renewed. They did get the Port Authority to agree to renew the lease, but of course the city has to agree, because part of the lands that they're owned by the city are the subject of the lease. And until the city says, yes, we extend, I don't think Porter's going to see the rest of its money. It may be enough, that 400 million or whatever it is, may be enough for Porter to say, I've got what I can get out of the Island Airport, and we'll be happy competing with the big guys out at Pearson with our jets. And that's a likely scenario from my perspective.
Thank you, Brian.
Mm-hmm.
Brian, this would be an opportunity for a free plug for Parks Not Planes if you want to take advantage of it.
Oh, I wish our website was up to say, oh, go to our website. But a new organization, some of the familiar faces many of you will know are involved. Certainly people from the island, people from York Key, from Bathurst Key, and Community Air, and Waterfront for All. And we think that it's time to mount a campaign to make the issue of converting the island airport lands to park or returning them back to parkland. This is the time to start a campaign and make that issue known, because at some point the politicians are going to notice that they have a potential issue out here that has to be dealt with, certainly within 12 years, or the airport does shut down. But what are we going to do? Are we going to renew the lease for airport use given climate change and everything else? Or are we going to look at much more exciting, much more compatible uses for the 215 acres of airport lands? And like Berlin, like Santa Monica, like Edmonton, like Chicago, close our downtown airport and add it to the park to make a massive park, 800 acres, the size of Central Park in New York City. That's what's happening, and that's where Parks Not Planes is going.
Thank you, Brian. I will take a couple of questions from people who put their hands up. My first one will be from Alex. Is Alex's iPhone? If you unmute yourself, Alex. There we go. Oh, try again. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. I'd like to say thank you very much to the speaker. That was really fascinating. I loved it. And I loved the scope. And I'm very interested in what possibilities he thinks could happen with the old terminal, which is very, very cute and could be a fabulous destination for people if it was a restaurant or a park or something all out there. And and what would be, I think it's maybe been answered by the previous speaker of how to sway politicians to maybe lean more towards going to parks than renewing the airport status, especially given how incredibly used the parks are, and even more so during COVID and just generally. And I'm a dog walker, so I'm acutely aware of it. Anyway, so Ron.
Well, thank you. As far as the old terminal goes, when it was moved to its present sort of situation, sitting in a field, there was a group of restaurateurs talking about renovating it and making it a rather nice location, looking out over the harbor and so on. But I haven't heard anything about it for years, and it's just sat there. So I don't know about that. Your other thing, I guess, was a question to say, how do we put our view forward if you consider the best use of that land to be parkland? Would be, I think, encouraging groups like Parks Not Planes, and letting politicians know from you individually that you want that. We've seen enormous pressure on the waterfront parks in the last year and a half. Pressure that's not just a summertime pressure anymore, it's a year-round pressure. And when you consider that Toronto has actually proved itself capable of surviving for a year and a half without a downtown airport, that really the balance of need is fairly clear. Everybody who, has said we need that airport has been proved wrong in the last year.
I'm going to ask Ellen, who raised her hand. Ellen, and I think there's two of you there, but go ahead and ask your question, please.
Okay, it wasn't me. It was actually David Smiley, who's the other person.
Oh, there's David. Oh, that's David Smiley. Hi, David Smiley.
Well, I recognize you too. Though we've gotten a bit older since the last time we were meeting.
I won't admit. I'm not going to admit to it. I'm not.
Okay, well, so I'll hug you the next time. Ron Jenkins, you did a great job. Thank you very much. Your presentation was excellent. I want to make a few comments. The airport terminal building, since I live on the island and have been actively working with the island master plan, I have mentioned more than once, many times, that the airport terminal building would be a great building that could be changed into a museum for Indigenous whatever on the island. Since the island master plan is missing the dollars to make it all work, I think the idea of the master of using the airport terminal would probably make some sense until we can get some wonderful architect to build something that would be more in somebody else's aspect. The reversion of the airport back to the island for inclusion into the island master plan has been resisted by all of the city representatives. It's seen as a political problem. And though, this goes back to Crombie and his reports, the island airport has been avoided or talked about in positive ways as a future possibility. We probably the people here realize that that is a pipe dream, and we're going to have to fight pretty hard because there's a lot of people with money involved, and we've seen, I mean, the fact that the federal government has only loaned the money this time instead of granted it, though will it be paid back, and who's paying it off? I think we are.
Yeah.
Okay, and the Mississaugas of the credit, whose land this was, have told me many times, different people, that the islands were not part of the original agreement, that David Crombie, wonderful guy who he has been at different times, was working for Mulrooney and included at the last minute the island airport or the islands on into the agreement that they had to sign, or it would be gone for another decade or more. And so they went for it. But they still have a great interest, and the island master plan is a very good opportunity if we can get over this hurdle to bring that piece of property back into public park land with a focus on
Indigeneity.
Thank you, Ellen. We work together a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Ron, do you want to respond to any of David's points or share some thoughts in that regard?
I think they're all interesting points. He mentioned David Crombie, and I would just add that the last page of my presentation, I didn't put it up, is actually a kind of a, I called it references, but it's a reading list, and you can look at a lot of material here, including the Royal Commission reports that Crombie worked on.
Well, we will share that, and depending on what the video recording of this looks like, we'll if it looks semi-decent and sounds okay, we'll attempt to share it probably within a month or so. But we certainly will put your presentation up on the Waterfront for All, waterfrontforall.ca website. And we also share a link to that in our Waterfront for All Facebook page as well. So you'll be able to see Ron's presentation, and certainly those references, I'm sure, will be of interest to many people. Laura Cooper, who's one of our board members from Waterfront for All. Welcome, Laura. If you want to go ahead, Laura.
It's a question for Ron. I was wondering if you could tell us about the people did they used to live on that land? Were there hotels? I read about ballparks and things like that. Can you tell us about, it was more than just a piece of land, right? Over the years?
Hanlon's Point. You're asking about Hanlon's Point, I think, are you? Hanlon's Point.
I don't know that.
Yeah. Hanlon's Point was from the late 1800s until the airport was built. A major amusement park and entertainment area for Torontonians. Lots of boating regattas. There was a hotel there. Rowing competitions. Of course, Ned Hanlon himself was an international rower. But Hanlon's Point is actually named after his father, who built a hotel there. There's quite a lot of history in that spot.
So where is it? Where is the land compared to the airport land today? Like, is it
where the ferry, where the Hanlon's Point ferry goes? It docks on that point of land, and there's a tugboat there, the Ned Hanlon tugboat up on the land.
Mm-hmm.
That was moved from the C&E grounds, but that's on Hanlon's Point now.
Right. Okay.
Okay, and I have Anna Portnell, who's another board member. Anna, I'm going to unmute you. Anna's an island resident and a board member of Waterfront for All. Anna, go ahead.
Yes, in connection to the question whether there was housing on Hanlon Point, yes, all the things that Ron mentioned were there, but yes, there were also houses. And when the airport was being built, they were floated to Algonquin Island. There's still some houses that are marked as having come from Hanlon's Point. They're built around the perimeter of Algonquin Island. And thank you, Ron. Great presentation.
Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, Anna. And it was mentioned too, there is indeed a meeting for the Island Master Plan tomorrow, the 21st. Justin kindly shared it in the chat for those of you who are sharing it. We've also shared the link to register for that meeting on our Facebook page, Waterfront for All. So there's a City of Toronto. You can go to the website and register for the meeting on the Island Master Plan. And if you're like David Smiley, you'll probably raise some inconvenient and uncomfortable questions. There's a couple of, so one of the questions, another question is in the chat, and I'm going to add, there we are. There you go. What's, is that, oh, someone just shared something. Is that you, Ron?
No.
Oh.
Looks
Okay.
like somebody with a Macintosh.
Oh. I'm not sure exactly what happened.
Anna Prodenu. Anna Prodenu.
Oh, is this your, oh. Okay. Anna, you're sharing something? Oh, there you go. Thanks, Anna. Anyway, one question is, so let's say the tripartite agreement ends and there's no more island airport. Who pays for the remediation of the land? And I guess you could, that would be required as part of any changeover into a park. Anyone want to take that question on? Ron, do you have an idea who pays for that? Is it the City of Toronto that gets the land back and pays for it?
I don't know. I mean, a small part of that land is actually the city's.
Right.
The predominant portion is Ports Toronto, Toronto Port Authority land. I don't know if there's any requirement in the tripartite agreement that they clean up afterwards. I don't know. If there isn't, I'm pretty sure they won't.
Right. Okay. Well, I suppose the federal government could, because the Ports Toronto is a creature of the federal government. So I suppose the federal government could mandate it to help clean up, use some of its money to clean up the airport if the airport was wound down. But that would be a political question, right?
There are a number of political questions surrounding the Toronto Port Authority, that is Ports Toronto, including the fact that the federal government started a ports modernization review process about 3 years ago, and it has been going in fits and starts. But looking at all of the federal ports across the country, there are 19 of them, and looking at whether they are feasible or how they can be done better. And Toronto would certainly be one that needs a lot of consideration because it's not really much of a port. It only squeaked into that category at the very end of the formation of the Toronto Port system. So I don't know.
Well, I guess it's certainly an agenda item to be added to folks who are interested in that outcome. Parks Not Planes would want to take that on. Tony Fairbrother.
The Port Authority itself.
Go ahead.
So the Port Authority itself is formed under the Canada Marine Act, and it's not a Crown corporation, it's a Crown business enterprise. A government business enterprise is what it's called, I'm sorry. Where it apparently is mandated to be self-sufficient, although what we're seeing is that it's not.
Right. Okay. We have another, there's also, someone also suggested in the chat that they heard from the airport if the, and Tony, I'm going to get to you in a sec, that if the lake levels exceeded 76.2 meters, the airport couldn't operate because it would impact the buildings and the facilities. Is that something we can have anything further to add to or clarify? Would the airport be unusable at 76.2 meters? Ron, do you know?
No,
okay.
it would be problematic. The airport is, I mean, all of the airport was put on sand, and the runways were reinforced in the last few years by the runway remediation process that Ports Toronto undertook. You may have seen barges running back and forth across the harbor, and they were pouring concrete down to strengthen the runway foundations. I don't know details about the condition of the runway foundations, except that, you know, a decade of Q400s landing and taking off is probably hard on runways that were never designed for that weight of aircraft.
Right. Tony Fairbrother, you have a question or a comment.
Yeah.
Tony? Oh, hang on, you just muted yourself again.
Unmute.
There we go.
Sorry.
There we are. Yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead.
I was me that made the 76 point because I was, when we had a workshop 2 years ago now about the flooding, the airport said that, you know, because they're quite concerned about the flooding and the operations, that it wasn't just the runways would still be operational perhaps, but the rest of the airport, so they couldn't service the runways, they couldn't bring people over. It just, so they are concerned about the, I mean, the fact that the runways could still operate doesn't mean the airport can run. So, but I was just wondering, I don't know how much time we have, but it's the political considerations that seem to be what we're not talking too much about. I mean, I think we're fortunate that the province doesn't have a share in the decision about the renewal of the lease, because we know our premier is pro-development or is very friendly with developers, and they'd love to get their hands on that land. But what do we know about the city and the federal government? I'm in talking to staff at the city about the master plan. They say the mayor doesn't want to have any discussions about the future of the airport and won't let them talk about it. And so they say they can't get anywhere until he decides whether he's running again. So I'm just curious, you know, what do we've heard on the different levels of government about what they would be interested to do or willing to do? Because I mean, the feds may like to have the land back if the Port Authority fails and do something different. Not necessarily what the city wants, right? Because it could be a Tory government or somebody else. So what do we know about the politics?
I think what we have seen is that city politicians to this point have been quite unwilling to reopen the topic of the airport in the future. But that being said, you know, they may not be able to avoid it for very long because there are significant pressures already, and it's not just the clock that's running out on feasibility of the airport. There's, I think, a real legitimate question whether Porter Airlines considers the Billy Bishop really central to their business if they've got a large investment in jets at Pearson and, you know, using Halifax, Ottawa, and Montreal, I think the other bases they're talking about.
Right.
At that point, you know, the airport again falls into the category of being economically unviable.
As well as potentially flooded frequently. What other safety issues and concerns are there respect to the island airport? Like, Ron, do you want to, I know you touched on some of them, but do you have a sense of a quick summary of sort of key safety concerns that have been raised about the airport in general?
Yeah, I would say that there are a couple of significant ones. One is the runways are short, already too short for the Q400s, in fact. For those planes to use the runways, they can't go with the full complement of seats. So there's that. The federal government is moving ahead slowly as they can, really, with implementing the runway and safety area requirements that are an international civil aviation authority requirement. And that's 150 meters added to each end of the runway. Whether that's added as new land or whether it's added as partial new land, partial, or whether it's a runway system that allows planes to stop before they overrun is unclear. But that's a safety issue of one degree. Another major safety issue is simply the ability to service the airport in case of a significant emergency, like a crash of a plane. The ferry has limited vehicular capability, and the number of vehicles that the ferry can carry hasn't changed since 1964, when the Maple City ferry started. Those ferries haven't got any larger. They can't carry any more vehicles than they ever could in terms of fire engines and so on, ambulances. When the airport conducts their safety trial sort of thing, they do it every couple of years. What they do is they bring fire engines and such over to the island side before they begin the safety rehearsal. So it's a bit of a farce. That's a safety issue. I would say those are the primary safety issues. Other safety issues have been raised, like fuel storage and things like that, but I don't think those are significant.
Okay, I think I don't think I've missed any key point that's been. Oh, well, there's another point. Sorry, there is another point in the chat that was made earlier that we didn't touch on, which was that Gordon suggested that most respectable studies have shown that when train service significantly improves, it has a direct impact on the relative popularity and use of airline travel. So that apparently is in fact a thing that we can say with some confidence, that improved intercity train travel does in fact impact short, medium haul flights that it would compete against, and makes them potentially less viable, less popular as train service improves. And thanks for that, Gordon. Laura, did you have another question?
No.
Okay, no, because your hands looked like you raised your hand again.
Really?
Yes, it's okay. If you did have one, that would be great. That would be fine. It would be totally cool. Okay, thanks, Laura. So it's 8:44, and we were and we don't want we don't want to keep you unduly, but are there any more? Are there any more questions or comments for Ron or on topic?
I just sent them to you via the chat, Edward.
Yeah, I think we got the safety question dealt with. We mentioned the Toronto Island Master Plan meeting tomorrow, and the link was shared in the chat. And yeah, I mean, a couple of people mentioned, oh, that's another thing with talking point. We talked about another chat talking point we had. And I know that, I think Brian alluded to it briefly, but yes, with the plans for Rail Deck Park seemingly coming to naught, or at best, if the development proposal for that Rail Deck Park area were actually to go ahead, at best, it would seem that you get no more than half or perhaps 40% of the park that was envisioned by the city. It would seem to make the case for considering expanding the island airport even more strong. So that was a point that was reiterated and mentioned in the chat. And oh, Julie, did you just, oh yeah, can Ports Toronto sell the land? Can it sell the island airport?
I don't know. They have sold 60 Harbor Street, and they have talked about, I think, selling other pieces of land or swapping land. I don't know. I don't know what their, the sale of 60 Harbor Street was enabled by a schedule in the Canada Marine Act that put that land into a category that enabled Ports Toronto to sell it. But I don't know if all of Ports Toronto's land is in that same category. That would be a question of looking into it in some detail.
Okay. And we have another question. What will Air Canada do if Porter stops using Island Airport?
They'll stop using it themselves at that point.
Oh, because they're just there to
I
compete
think.
with them, you think? Yeah.
Yeah,
don't know if-
yeah, I think so.
Just Brian, do you have any thoughts on that? If you unmute yourself. Oh,
Yeah, I agree with Ron. The Air Canada is only there to trying to keep Porter honest. It's costing them a lot of money. We heard $1 million a month or something they were losing on keeping planes at the Island Airport. That's it's once Porter's gone, or once they start winding down their business at the Island Airport, Air Canada won't stay around much. So this issue of selling, whether the Port Authority can sell, we were pretty distressed that the federal government allowed Ports Toronto to sell 30 Bay or 60 Harbor. They allowed the sale price of $93 million to be put into Ports Toronto's coffers instead of putting it to some better public benefit. And it's that $93 million of public asset money that is being used to prop up the airport when it could be used to pay for, say, a new island ferry terminal. It could be used to all kinds of things, or even as the money we need, or more than the money we need, to make the airport lands back into a park. There's a lot of great uses for that $93 million. As far as we can see, they've used about 10 million of the 93, so there's still an $83 million left. They did say that they thought that they were worried that the $85 million that they agreed to pay for the construction of the tunnel, and they're paying that at about $7-8 million a year until 2034. They did say that they were worried that they may not be able to pay that if they didn't get the cash from 30 Bay Street, and that was their rationale for keeping the money, and that seemed to persuade the federal government. We did ask Adam Vaughan to see if he could do anything to stop it, and unfortunately it was beyond his ability to do so. So
thank
there.
you, Brian. And it's been pointed, yeah, so that it is clear, it is a couple of questions. Well, point again in the chat was that, yes, the Island Airport lands are not part of the City of Toronto's master plan process for the island at this, as we understand it. That's my understanding, correct? Correct, right? Right. Though, of course, those of you who are participating in the conversation on the Toronto Island Master Plan would be democratically free to raise that issue, whether or not staff or city representatives wish and elected officials wish to deal with it. It doesn't stop you from raising it. It doesn't stop you from setting the agenda ahead of time. That you're free to do that. And yes, we've asked. So yes, I think we will make this video recording, assuming it's not a completely filled with weird, strange sounds or scratchy video. We will attempt to make it available in the forthcoming near future, not immediately, but in the near future, because we do need to look at it and perhaps edit and trim it here and there, and depending. And we will, much sooner than that, we will be posting Ron's slide deck probably as a PDF at Waterfront for All's website, and with a link to it in our Facebook page. One other question. I'm not sorry. Just to remind us again, because you touched on it before. The Newport folks who bought the terminal from Porter, do we know what was their timeline to get their money, their payments back? I'm not sure the time.
There are two ways of looking at it. One is that they would need to recover it by 2033 because that's when the tripartite agreement expires and they can't be guaranteed of time beyond that. The other is the deal when it was sold by Porter included what was called an option, a 40-year option that would take it to 2053. But that would need to be agreed by the three parties of the tripartite agreement. So it can't really be built in as a side deal. Whether Newport's financial calculations, whether their estimation of the value of the terminal and the expected return over whatever number of years takes that into account seriously or not, I don't know. I know that the revenue stream that Newport expects from Porter is around $191,000 a day. And you can multiply that by 365 and by the remaining time of the tripartite agreement, and you get, I think, around $69 million. I would run that again to be sure, but so I think that they're looking for longer, and whether they get it or not, I don't know. Maybe they're tossing the dice.
Right, they're tossing the dice. Yeah, and of course, another thing was we talked about the loan, the loan that Porter got from the federal government. I mean, the principle of the thing is, I'm sure we would all hope and like to see that Porter pays that money back, maybe with the money they make from jets at Pearson. But if I guess it's kind of a cold comfort to realize that regardless of what we think about loan, it is a tiny, almost infinitesimal fraction of the federal budget. So again, it could have it could have gone to better uses, perhaps. And I think most people here would have thought that perhaps Porter that some other, more deserving, more socially responsible company would have received that money to help them stay afloat through the pandemic. But, just to put that in perspective, sometimes we forget with numbers, how large the federal budget is.
That's all true, although I'm surprised in some ways when Porter was trying to convince people in the 2013 jet expansion, one of the things they said was, we're going to create a lot of aviation manufacturing jobs in Canada by buying this Bombardier plane. Now they're buying Brazilian manufactured aircraft, and I would have thought that the loans might have tied the value of the loan to some sort of buy Canadian idea, but it doesn't seem that was the case.
Yeah, okay. Well, it would be pretty to think so, but as you said, it doesn't seem to be the case. Well, you know what? I want to thank you very much, Ron. Thank you so much for this. I certainly learned a lot of things that I didn't know before. I'm sure others have as well. Thank you, everyone, for participating this evening. It was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much, Brian, for being our always welcome but perhaps unexpected guest this evening. Appreciate it immensely. And yes, look for the slide deck on our website and with a link to it on our Facebook page. For those of you who are interested, register and attend the Toronto Island Master Plan meeting tomorrow. And we will again endeavor in the coming weeks to have a version of this video recording available, and we'll figure out how to make that happen. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you. We plan to have another Waterfront for All Speaker Series #4, likely in September, and we'll let you know what that more about that and look for announcements on our social media feeds and on our website. Thank you all very much. Bonne nuit, bonne soirée, good night.